Hello. So I'm re-recording a lecture that I put online about anti-Semitism as part of a class that I teach as a university professor with a PhD in sociology. And the class is called Sociology of Race and Racism. And one of the many weeks was about anti-Semitism. And the lecture makes reference to an article by Sander Gilman. One of my research interests as a sociologist was anti-Semitism, which was one of many, many forms of discrimination that sociologists study. However, what I've found is that uh, whenever there is a public discussion of anti-Semitism, unlike other discussions, say about the caste system or anti-Black racism, slavery, there tends to be a great deal of censorship. And I do think it is because anti-Semitism involves the imagined white middle class. And I do think it is about class antagonism. But I will re-record this lecture and hopefully the video will not be taken down because people have all these anxieties and maybe particularly the white middle class. So here we go. I'll share my screen and I will again try to give this lecture about anti-Semitism. I'm sure Daniel and David will be okay. I'm sure they'll make money one day. So, anti-Semitism is something that Sander Gilman writes about extensively. And Sander Gilman also wrote a really interesting essay about Sarji Bartman, who was a South African woman who was part of the Khoikhoi tribe, which is one of many South African tribes. And Bartman was forced by European colonizers to come to France and put on display for French colonizers. And Sarji Barton was kidnapped as a young woman. She never married. She never gave birth to her own children. She was put on display. She was held in a cage. Her genitalia was stared at. She was abused in every possible way. And when she died at a young age, George Cuvier, whose name is one of many great white men's names on the Eiffel Tower, George Cuvier took out her brain and genitals and put them in jars to study them. So Sandra Gilman has written a lot of essays, and one of the essays he's written is about anti-Semitism, but he has also written extensively about other forms of atrocity against other groups of people. So there are four themes in this lecture. Firstly, anti-Semitism and eugenics. Secondly, racial hierarchy, race, and colonial theory. Thirdly, racism and disease. Fourthly, ethnic cleansing and war. So anti-Semitism can be discussed as a form of eugenics, and Achille Mbembe is also one of the authors that we've read in this university class called Sociology of Race and Racism. And Achille Mbembe is a Black South African post-colonial scholar who uses the Holocaust as one of many examples of necropolitics. So anti-Semitism is hostility to, prejudice towards, or discrimination against Jews. This sentiment is a form of racism, and a person who harbors it is called an anti-Semite. Primarily, anti-Semitic tendencies may be motivated by negative sentiment towards Jews as a people or by negative sentiment towards Jews with regard to Judaism. In the former case, usually presented as racial anti-Semitism, a person's hostility is driven by the belief that Jews constitute a distinct race with inherent traits or characteristics that are repulsive or inferior to preferred traits or characteristics within that person's society. In the latter case, known as religious anti-Semitism, a person's hostility is driven by their religion's perception of Jews and Judaism, typically encompassing doctrines of supersession that expect or demand Jews to turn away from Judaism and submit to the religion presenting itself as Judaism's successor faith. This is a common theme within the other Abrahamic religions. So, the kind of censorship that often emerges when people try to document anti Semitism as one of many forms of discrimination is perhaps about whiteness and the desire to construct Jewish people as white or to see oneself as white, even though you or someone or people are perhaps still persecuted minorities like Jewish people. So this desire for whiteness is, I think, comes with a great deal of anxiety about gender roles, anxiety about masculinity, anxiety about money, anxiety about speech, and anxiety about discussing anti-Semitism itself. Anxiety is also obviously a source of a great deal of aggression in discussions regarding Israel and Palestine. So, the development of racial and religious anti Semitism has historically been encouraged by the concept of anti Judaism, which is distinct from anti Semitism itself. There are various ways in which anti Semitism is manifested, ranging the levels of severity of Jewish persecution. On the more subtle end, it consists of expressions of hatred or discrimination against individual Jews, and may or may not be accompanied by violence. On the most extreme end, it consists of programs or genocide, which may or may not be state sponsored. So, some of the most interesting theorists and thinkers regarding anti Semitism and some of the most serious and well-informed critics of Zionism as well have been Jewish feminists and queer theorists such as Judith Butler and Naomi Klein. And it's interesting to think about anti-Semitism from the perspective of intersectionality. Jewish feminists and Jewish transgender and queer authors have often clearly documented and protested against anti-Semitism, particularly anti-Semitism experienced by the most marginalized Jewish people, such as the working class, mixed race Jewish people of color who are visibly racialized, Jewish people with disabilities, queer Jewish people, transgender Jewish people, and of course, people who live outside of the global north. So the feminist movement and queer movement has been central to firstly, honestly addressing the politics of discrimination, hatred that still exists and often leads to extreme hate crime. And secondly, documenting the ways that these hate crimes can lead to Zionism or to separatist movements. And the queer and feminist movement has produced really remarkable Jewish feminist and transgender and queer authors who have examined the ways that persecution can lead to the creation of ethnic and religious communities that often feel justified in persecuting women or queer people in an effort to create some sort of pseudo-nationalism as a response to the unfortunate or the often unfortunate treatment of minorities. And this is something that many South Asian feminists and Muslim feminist and queer scholars have also documented, in Jewish feminism and queer Jewish writings were really foundational in the building of feminist and queer people of color critique. So, Sandra Gilman discusses the relationship between romantic relationships and anti Semitism. What fascinated me, writes Gilman, were the brackets. Advertisements for Jews or for African Americans or for whites made it clear that individuals were interested in choosing their sexual partners from certain designated groups within American society. But the brackets implied that here was a woman who was both white and Jewish. Given the racial politics of post-civil rights America, where do Jews fit in? It made me ask the question, which the woman who placed the personal advertisement clearly was addressing: are Jews white? And what does white mean in this context? The politics of love, of romantic desire, of childbirth, of eugenics, miscegenation, nation building, the politics of even friendship and collegiality are never without um, a certain cynicism regarding the ways that one uh, sees people try to align themselves with the most privileged people in order to serve their own class interest and egoism, while at the same time decreeing themselves to be left wing or progressive in a time where being left wing or progressive is a brand. So Gilman, along with other theorists like Achille Mbembe, discussed the ways that the human body is an image of society. Throughout the whole history of the Holocaust, the defilement and desecration of Jewish people's bodies, queer people's bodies, people with disabilities' bodies became an image of society. The human body continues to be treated as an image of society, and there can be no natural way, writes Gilman, of considering the body that does not involve at the same time a social dimension. Interest in its apertures depends on the preoccupation with social exits and entrances, escape routes and invasions. If there is no concern to preserve social boundaries, I would not expect to find concern with bodily boundaries. Which is interesting to think about. If there's no concern to preserve social boundaries, I would not expect to find concern with bodily boundaries. And so, what are the terms of these social boundaries that then lead to concern with bodily boundaries? And hopefully, it is okay to play this clip because I played it before in other lectures that were not about anti-Semitism, and it wasn't flagged by anyone. So hopefully it's okay. The baby will be okay. Oh my God. So this is a clip of Judith Butler, who's not your baby, but is a really well-respected intellectual. And Judith Butler discusses the ways that as a Jewish intellectual, Judith Butler's interest in human rights begins from their own lived experience. And the example of the Holocaust is one of many examples of genocidal thinking and action.
Mean by that is that everybody has certain
Also, this is what I look like, and and anti-Semitism is one of my research interests, just like Sandra Gilman wrote about Sarji Bartman, a South African woman. So That's all true.
So there are many different theories of gender, and mine is just one. Sometimes people who really hate gender name me as the one who made this up, but that's actually not true. You know, in my view, everybody has a theory of gender. And what I mean by that is that everybody has certain assumptions going about what gender is or should be. And at a certain point in life, we ask ourselves, wow, where did that assumption come from? At this point, I'm less concerned about whose theory is right and whose theory is wrong, because the assault on gender is also an assault on democracy. We have the power and the freedom to make more livable lives for ourselves, where bodies can be more free to breathe, to move, to love without discrimination and without fear of violence. I am Judith Butler, distinguished professor in the graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley. I teach literature, philosophy, and critical theory, and I'm most well known for my two books on gender, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter from the early 1990s. My work has been translated into more than 27 languages. I insist that what it is to be a woman, or indeed what it is to be a man or any other gender, is an open-ended question. We have a whole range of differences, biological in nature, so I don't deny them, but I don't think they determine who we are in some sort of final way. At the heart of these controversies is the distinction between sex and gender. But what is that distinction? How do we think about it? Sex is generally a category that is assigned to infants that has importance within medical and legal worlds. Gender is a mix of cultural norms, historical formations, family influence, psychic realities, desires and wishes, and we have a say in that. My early life was affected by the 1960s and the social movements that took shape during that time. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, part of a Jewish community. And by the time I was in high school, I was politically active, but I was also taking university courses in philosophy. In my 20s, I came to see that it was not just the Jews who were apprehended and extinguished by the Nazi regime. It was queer people, it was gay, lesbian people, it was people with disabilities, people with illnesses, Polish workers, communists. And my sense was that one needed to widen the lens and see that many people have been subject to genocidal politics, and to understand that there are different forms of oppression. I remain convinced that one does need to know history in order to make sure it does not repeat, and that one wants justice not just for the group to which one belongs, but for any group that suffers in a similar way. In the 70s and 80s, I was part of a movement of people who were rethinking gender during that time. Queer theory was emerging. It was in a complicated conversation with feminism. Trans issues had not yet surfaced as part of our contemporary reality. So it was a moment in which we asked questions like, what has society made of us, and what can we make of ourselves? There were a number of versions of feminism that I tended to oppose. One of them held that, well, women are fundamentally mothers and that maternity is the essence of the feminine. And then a second one thought that feminism was about sexual difference, but the way they defined sexual difference was always presumptively heterosexual. And both of them struck me as wrong. I was pretty committed to the idea that people ought not to be discriminated against on the basis of what they do with their body, if they, who they love or how they move or how they look. All I was saying is that the sex you're assigned at birth and the gender that you are taught to be should not determine how you live your life.
Are you constantly overwhelmed with your workload? Look at this schedule, perfectly organized and managed with every task completed on time. If you're looking to increase your productivity and manage your time more effectively, I want you to imagine starting your day with a clear plan, effortlessly moving through tasks, meeting all your deadlines, and ending the day feeling accomplished and stress-free. Because I know a tool that can help you achieve this. And before you think I'm crazy, I want to show you how you can increase your productivity by 25% and manage your time effortlessly just 5 minutes from now. Maybe you've tried other productivity tools before, but found them confusing.
Sometimes people point to gender trouble as the inception of gender theory, but people were working on gender before me, Gail Rubin and Juliet Mitchell and Simone de Beauvoir herself. Simone de Beauvoir was an existential philosopher and a feminist philosopher who wrote The Second Sex in the 1940s. The basic point was that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, that the body is not a fact. She opened up the possibility of a difference between the sex you're assigned and the sex you become. Gail Rubin was an anthropologist and remains an anthropologist who wrote an extremely influential article called The Traffic in Women. And what she tried to say was that the family was a structure whose task it was to reproduce gender. And one of the aims it had was to kind of keep heterosexuality looking really normal. And although it was part of feminist anthropology at the time, it allowed us to start thinking about gender as something that could be reproduced, crafted, cultivated, and that there were systems, frameworks to which gender belongs. There was one other dimension of Rubin's work, which was, interestingly, psychoanalysis. She basically said, well, maybe there's a whole lot of repression going into becoming a man and a whole lot of repression going into becoming a woman. And that one of the things we have to do is to conform with existing gender norms, is to rule out all those possibilities of being, feeling, doing, loving that don't line up with the gender norms that are governing our lives. So anthropology, psychoanalysis, they all had their place in that moment way before gender trouble emerged on the scene. I think at the time that I wrote Gender Trouble, people treated gender as if it was a natural fact or a sociological reality, but they didn't treat it as something that you could make and remake. Performance is important to the extent that we do enact who we are. And anybody in performance studies actually knows that there are performances that we do in our lives that are not mere performance, they're not fake. When performative was first coined as a word, the philosopher J.L. Austin was trying to understand legal utterances.
So I should state that in addition to other forms of discrimination, Canada has comprehensive laws protecting gender identity and gender expression. So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and to the Criminal Code.
When a judge says, I declare you man and wife, you'll become man and wife once that declaration has happened. That's not fake. That happened. Now, what if we were to say that in enacting our lives as a particular gender, we are actually realizing that gender anew. We are making something real happen. When gay and lesbian people started coming out, or when trans people started living openly, something changed in the world. By appearing, speaking, acting in certain ways, reality changed. And it has changed. We are seeing the changing of terms. We no longer speak about family, woman, man, desire, sex in the same way. Even the Cambridge Dictionary acknowledges that something has changed. Okay, so when we talk about performative, we're talking about an act that makes something come into being or an act that has real consequences. We're talking about the changing of reality.
Together, let's practice what we pray and build a global church of change, working to end extreme.
Even among progressive and liberal people I know, there can sometimes be a real resistance to thinking about trans rights or lesbian and gay rights or even women's rights. They sometimes say that these are secondary issues, or it simply makes them uncomfortable. Why should I have to refer to someone as a he or a she or a they? And yet, at least in the US, we learned how to talk about Black people differently, or we talk about women differently. And sure, it was probably hard to learn how to use new language. Maybe we had to adjust our habits, but stumbling is part of learning, and making an error is part of learning, especially when we're learning something new. Sometimes we can all be vitriolic. Some certain statements will set me off and I will scream. But if I only were to do that, then I would never be having a conversation with anyone. I think we all want to be the moral center of our universe. Like, that's right, that's wrong. You're canceled, you're not. You're with me, you're against me. But we have to allow ourselves to be challenged and accept the invitation to revise our ways of thinking, because that's the only way of being open to people who are trying to make their claims, sometimes for the very first time, to be heard, to be known, to be acknowledged. Now, I'm less interested in defending a theory of gender. I'm much more concerned with finding creative and effective ways of countering the attack on gender. One problem is that many people who refuse to allow trans people to define themselves is that they feel that their own self-definition is destabilized. The idea that we can change reality, transform reality to be more open, inclusive, just, less violent. There's an instability in that that's very frightening to people who want to understand their genders as fixed. But is anybody's gender necessary and universal, or is it a complicated emergence that happens with each of us? Our deepest sense of self is also formed in time, and we can't always know in advance what that will be. Freedom is a struggle because there's so much in our world that's telling us not to be free with our bodies. And if we are seeking to love in a free way, to live and move in a free way, we actually have to struggle to claim that freedom. When we live in a democracy, we assume that we're living according to certain principles: equality, freedom, justice. And yet we're constantly learning what freedom is and what equality is and what justice can be. And those challenges, right? The anti-slavery movement, the suffrage movement, the movement for LGBTQIA plus rights. I mean, each of those struggles involve challenging people's existing ideas of who's equal, who has the right to be free, and how do we define justice? We are all the time struggling to achieve that goal. We need to reoccupy these notions and show that concerns with racial justice and gender equality and gender freedom are an integral part of any democratic struggle, especially if we want to rethink who the people are and what it means for them to live in freedom without fear.
Let's just wrap up the gender stuff. Unless you want to take a break from gender, we can go back to that. Do you want to let me give you the prompt for the last few
minutes? My whole life I've wanted to take a break from gender. I can never take a break from gender.
Get smarter, fast.
So that's a clip of Judith Butler. And Judith Butler is one of many controversial people and many controversial academics when this time period is trying to discuss anti-Semitism while also discussing Palestine. So in March 2024, which was not very long ago, in Paris, in Pantin, which is outside of Paris, and Butler, who uses they them pronouns, said that these attacks were an act of, quote, resistance. Their words quickly sparked strong reaction after several excerpts were posted on social media. So the American philosopher Judith Butler, a leading figure in gender studies, reignited a controversy on the left, which remains at loggerheads over the massacres committed by Hamas in Israel. On October 7th, 2023, during this roundtable discussion outside Paris, Butler said that these attacks were an act of resistance. So, and this led to a great deal of controversy. And the audience obviously welcomed Judith Butler and were in agreement with Judith Butler's views. But when these comments reach social media, they obviously reach a different audience. So Judith Butler has also written extensively and given lectures about the queering of anti-Semitism. And as one of the most impressive intellectuals of our time, Butler obviously has written and given lectures that are really theoretically and philosophically rich about the relationship between gender, sexuality, and anti-Semitism. Author Corinne Blackmer discusses this intersection between anti-Semitism and queer studies, stating the following: as the academic field of queer studies has become more visible and influential, some of its leading proponents have pushed the idea that opposing Israel's existence is a natural position for gay and lesbians to adopt. Blackmer further states that Israel's protection for gay people and its thriving gay culture in cities like Tel Aviv should not be thought of as positives, but are in fact evidence that the country is guilty of pinkwashing its sins. Israel gives gays and lesbians rights, these critics contend, only as a means of deflecting attention from the country's mistreatment of Palestinians. And so groups like Queers Against Israeli Apartheid did a lot of activism and still do a lot of activism, but this activism has always been really controversial for many reasons. I would argue that the kind of anxieties about discussions of anti-Semitism, and specifically discussions of anti-Semitism from a feminist perspective and a queer perspective and an anti-racist perspective, are really anxieties that take us back to the time of eugenics and these kind of fears about who can or cannot discuss anti-Semitism or what anti-Semitism means for future nation building, but also for very intimate relations of power, are really emotional topics because of eugenics. So eugenics is the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Developed largely by Sir Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race, eugenics is increasingly discredited as unscientific and racially biased during the 20th century, especially after the adoption of its doctrines by the Nazis in order to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups. So eugenics is central to nation building in Turtle Island or Canada, where this class, Sociology of Race and Racism, was taught. And so authors discuss the ways in which legacies of genocide and eugenics were taken up and passed along. And many post-colonial theorists and feminist scholars who write about Canada have discussed the ways in which the exalted are always tied to those who are denigrated, and individualization obscures systemic and normative violence. Critique can collude with the status quo on contextualizing life skills training in the professional psychologies as both ethnocentric and internally eccentric within what I have called my culture, and on taking behavior modification assumptions about repetitious learning to their logical conclusion and consideration of what it means to practice living in an institution and to have others intervene and take control when one is becoming angry. The practices I have described are well within the normal everyday operations of countless diverse institutions all over the world, and they're so widespread, of course, because of colonialism. So Canada has a whole series of ongoing class action lawsuits against nurses and healthcare providers who are accused of sterilizing Indigenous women without their consent. And this politics of eugenics is obviously connected to land. And I would argue that eugenics is often never separate from the politics of occupying land. So Senator Gilman discusses the relationship between race as a theory and the politics of racism, and the construction of race often involves conflations of religion and race. And this is true in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, that there is a collapsing of race as an idea that is essentialist and immutable, and religion as a practice. And the racialization of religion is similar to the construct of race overall, which often involves imagining groups of people in a certain geographical area or from a certain geographical area as having similar behavioral traits or feelings or capacity to succeed, or intellectual capacity. All of this is the work of constructing race or creating racial hierarchy. And racial hierarchies are often created for the purpose of colonial rule and for the purposes of justifying class stratification and discrimination. And its most extreme, racial hierarchies justify murder. So Gilman cites Theodosius Dabansky, who noted in 1967, every person has age, no type, and a life history different from any other person, be that person a member of his family, clan, race, or mankind. Beyond the universal rights of all human beings, which may be a typological notion, a person ought to be evaluated on his own merits. Tabansky and many scientists in the 1960s dismissed race as a category of scientific evaluation, arguing that whenever it had been included over the course of history, horrible abuses had resulted. At the same time, within Western, specifically American culture of the 1960s, there was also a transvaluation of the concept of race. Black was beautiful and roots were to be celebrated, not denied. The view was that seeing oneself as being part of a race was a strengthening factor. We at the close of the 20th century have, however, not suddenly become callous to the negative potential of the concept of race. Given its abuse in the Shoah, writes Gilman, as well as in neo-colonial policies throughout the world, it is clear that a great deal of sensitivity must be used in employing the very idea of race. In reversing the idea of race, we have not eliminated its negative implications. We have only masked them. For it is also clear that the meanings associated with race impacts on those included within these constructed categories. It forms them and shapes them, and this can be a seemingly positive or a clearly negative response. There is no question that there are real, i.e. shared genetic distinctions within and between groups, but the rhetoric of what this shared distinction comes to mean for the general culture and for the groups so defined becomes central to any understanding of the implications of race. The racialization of religion is really interesting because I think it allows people to continue to have fantasies that there are distinct groups or races of people that can be separated and that only have access to certain things and that cannot intermix, or that can be spoken of as distinct groups. And from a feminist and queer perspective, trying to racialize religion also allows one to have sexist and heterosexist fantasies about women and queer people or people in general who are imagined to be gendered and only have certain sexual agency because of their imagined religiosity, which is something that can be discerned from anyone who could look at someone's skin or name. I don't practice a religion. And so this kind of racialization of religion again allows for the continuance of hierarchies of race and for the justification of class antagonism. So Gilman states that in reversing the idea of race, we have not eliminated its negative implications. We have only masked them. For it is also clear that the meanings associated with race impacts on those included within these constructed categories. It forms them and shapes them, and this can be a seemingly positive or a clearly negative response. There is no question that there are real, i.e. shared distinctions, but this kind of distinction is not necessarily something that obviously will determine behavior or will determine morality or will determine class position or will determine desire or lack thereof. So Senator Gilman discusses the relationship between disease and racism and the ways that imagining race to be an essentialist idea, something that all people of a certain group share, imagining that all people of a certain group with certain names and facial features are the same, allows one to then pathologize this group of people. So the exaltation of people as being part of a certain community, say the exaltation of all Hindus, corresponds with the previous hatred or degradation of all of these imagined peoples. Simply reversing a negative stereotype to turn it into a form of exaltation does not question the kind of complete fiction of this idea of ethnic or religious or racial communities that speak in a singular voice. And from a feminist and queer perspective, what is extremely dangerous is that this singular voice is often the voice of a very privileged cisgender heterosexual man. So Gilman discusses the ways that medical racism was central to anti-Semitism, and Gilman makes really strong comparisons between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. And in this time period, I think it is really interesting to think about who wants to make these comparisons and will accept these comparisons and who will not and why not. All races, writes Gilman, according to the ethnology of the day, were described in terms of aesthetics as either ugly or beautiful. African Blacks, especially the Hottentot, as I have shown elsewhere, became the epitome of the ugly race. And being ugly, as I've also argued, was not merely a matter of aesthetics, but was a clear sign of pathology of disease. Being Black was not beautiful. Indeed, the blackness of the African, like the blackness of the Jew, was believed to mark a pathological change in the skin, the result of congenital syphilis. And as we shall see, syphilis was given the responsibility for the form of the nose. One bore the signs of one's disease status on one's anatomy and by extension in one's psyche. So I would argue from my own experiences and my extensive research as an academic with a PhD and postdoc that sexism and heterosexism and a really, really desperate and pathetic desire to pretend that one is the most privileged capitalist often mean that people, and particularly the most privileged people of any ethnic group or persecuted minority, often don't like to hear that racism and anti-Semitism exist. So it's quite typical for rich men to really want to pretend that they're white and to not like the obvious truth of the possibility of hate crime. So Gilman writes, Jews look different. They have a different appearance, and this appearance has pathogenomic significance. Skin color marked the Jew as both different and diseased. For the Jewish scientists such as Sigmund Freud, these minor differences in people who are otherwise alike form the basis of feelings of strangeness and hostility between them. And these minor differences in people who are otherwise alike, I think, is what makes anti-Semitism so menacing and so severe and so psychologically disturbing to those who experience it, but also so psychologically disturbing to those who refuse to accept it, because many Jewish people in the Americas and the global North can often pass as white. Then this kind of passing, this almost the same but not white, as Homi Bhabha discussed in relation to colonial mimicry, creates this anxiety. And it's an anxiety of naming that which cannot be assimilated, which is historical atrocity. If historical atrocities like the Holocaust will never actually be forgotten and are often always at risk of leading to hate crimes that involve mimicking anti-Semitism and practices of hate crime that existed during the Holocaust, then the problem is that capitalist meritocracy will never allow us to fully overcome hate crime and overcome histories of hate crime. And I think this is what disturbs people, that we cannot simply talk away the history of the Holocaust or slavery. And I think it really disturbs people who really want there to be a capitalist success story that ends critique. And I would argue that capitalism will never be something that exists outside of histories of colonialism and slavery and anti-Semitism. No amount of money will prevent the possibility that hate crimes can recur again and again, and that the same forms of behavior that marked the Jewish body during the Holocaust could erupt again. So Sandra Gilman writes of the ways that anti-Semitism led to this marking of the Jewish body as one that carried disease. And this medical racism allowed for the justification of murder. And Gilman specifically writes of the Jewish nose and the ways that the appearance of the body of Semitic appearances in a face and of Jewish names were seen to be a sign of poor health or degeneracy that then justified the impoverishment of Jewish people, and in the most extreme instances, murder. So far from being a matter of choice or taste or aesthetic judgment, far from being a kind of casual topic, beauty and the way that people look was central to the construction of Jewish people as a race of people who could be actively discriminated against and constructed to have a disease that lived on the skin. And this is similar to the case of Saartjie Baartman, whose gender identity and whose South African body was actually constructed as being at odds with white European humanity, which then made her an object of scientific inquiry, rape, exhibitionism, and murder. So finally, I'll finish by discussing ethnic cleansing and war. And I think one of the reasons that lectures about anti-Semitism and comments about anti-Semitism are really controversial in this time period is obviously because of ongoing conflicts in Palestine and Israel. So this discussion of race will never be innocent, and there will never be a single person who talks about race or anti-Semitism who is innocent. These discussions will always lead one back to looking at histories of protectionism, ethno-nation building, the creation of enclosed ethnic communities, all of which lend themselves to the normalization of ethnic cleansing and to the creation of separate ethnic communities and religious communities that often do not allow for the full participation of queer people and women. The language of race and racial hierarchy has always benefited some and not others. And there's not a single person, I would argue, in the world who is not implicated in the story of race and who does not somehow benefit from discrimination. This is true of the caste system. It is true of Hindu nationalism, and it is true of the state of Israel. It is also true of anti-Semitism and the creation of predominantly Christian and Catholic European and North American countries. So by the close of the 19th century, the reality of the physical difference of the Jew as a central marker of race had come more and more into question. Antithetical theories such as those of Frederick Ratzel began to argue that skin color was a reflex of geography and could and did shift when a people moved from one part of the globe to another. For the Jewish scientists such as Sigmund Freud, as I said, these minor differences in people became the basis of feelings of strangeness and hostility. And in my PhD dissertation, I discussed humor, and I discussed the ways that humor and Jewish humor was a way of managing anxiety. The tendentious jokes, what Sigmund Freud referred to as jokes about sex or race, jokes about murder or death, jokes about humanity, jokes about the destruction of humanity. These jokes allow us to alleviate this underlying anxiety that we live with about the fragility of the human condition. But once the laughter subsides, we continue to live with this anxiety. And the Holocaust is obviously not something that can be erased in history. And the ongoing forms of ethnic cleansing in Israel and Palestine, ongoing protests that have been extremely violent and volatile continue. So hopefully people will accept this recorded lecture for sociology of race and racism. Hopefully everyone will still have a great baby and a great brunch. I'll finish with this quote by Elie Wiesel, if they can afford that, and if they're alive. Okay, so I'll finish with this quote by Elie Wiesel. I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. So I hope you take my side as someone who is trying to make money by recording these lectures. Thanks. Cheers. And I'm part of the Indian diaspora. And there are many Jewish Indians in Mumbai. We're probably enjoying some tasty foods and having a good time. So I hope you are too. Cheers.